Hi everyone, and welcome to Pro Tools Answers, where three marginally certifiable Pro Tools experts and master instructors, talking about those guys, discuss, demonstrate and elaborate on your Pro Tools questions put to the community in Avid's official Facebook support forum. I'm your host, Dave Phillips, audio engineer and lecturer for Point Blank in the UK. And on today's show, we're tackling a question that came from David, no relation, who emailed us today following our video on interconnected systems. We think that was episode 38, wasn't it? Yep. And his email says this. It says, "Hi guys, I apologise up front for bothering you, but I just watched one of your Pro Tools Answers videos, which really helped me in a few areas, so you're forgiven, and I'm a new subscriber. Welcome. Woohoo! I have a question that I can't find a complete answer to, which is connecting two computers. In episode 38, you guys spoke specifically about connecting multiple Pro Tools Ultimate systems, and in passing, Andy mentioned that one can connect two systems of any DAW and not just Pro Tools. See, this is what happens when Andy says stuff.
I know. I need to watch my words.
Yeah, and not to mention, it doesn't need to be Pro Tools Ultimate. You could do this with standard versions of Pro Tools as well, right?
Yeah, indeed. Yep. So his issue is that he wants to purchase a second PC, but I want to make sure it will work and how to make the connections. I've researched YouTube, contacted multiple computer makers of audio PCs, but still don't know where to turn for clear instruction. Lol. I'm just not technical, but we're his last ditch attempt. I'm just not technical, but I can do stuff with some specifics. I have an i9 PC with a Focusrite USB 8 Pre, which works great for my little project room. I use Pro Tools Standard, not HD or Ultimate. I have my old Digi 003R, which is Firewire 400, but even so, I just want to run my VSTs, of which I use many, and use my Focusrite system as the master. I think I need word clock, but I know there will be some preference configuration to do, but I'm lost after that. MIDI, network, ADAT, ... Just not sure. I truly apologise for my amateurish question. Forgiven. And maybe you can point me to where I can find some detailed information. Well, it may well be these guys here. It's going to be a challenge getting the cost of a new PC past the wife, so if I get called out on it, I at least want to make sure it works. Thank you for your help."
But don't we all have like that fear in our lives? Like if I were to die, my wife would probably sell the stuff for the price that I've told her that I bought them for, and that is my worst nightmare. Right?
Dude, I went down to Australia. I did some training in Australia at a reseller who sold Warwick basses, which I've always wanted a Warwick bass, and I'm like, and they're like, "Well, do you want one? We could sell you at a price." I'm like, "Yeah." And I bought one, and as I was coming back home, I was thinking, how am I going to get this in the house without having to tell my wife that I went on a trip and bought a guitar? She wasn't home when I got here, and so I walked it upstairs, and it's here now, and I think she doesn't even know I own it. I think I actually
Andy, well, Andy, not to do anything bad for you, but I can see it in the background. There is a Warwick bass hanging on your wall.
That's my second Warwick bass.
Oh, okay.
Do you know, it's okay. I don't even think she watches the show. I think we're not. She's not even a subscriber. Well, so you've. Yeah, you guys have just met the catalysts to getting to the right answer today. So say hello to Anders.
Hey.
And you just met Andy as well.
How you doing?
And you've probably learned a little bit more about Andy than his wife does. And before we start, I just want to give a shout out to our Patreon supporters who support Pro Tools Answers each month. Many thanks to Don, Mike, Matthew, Gregor, Eric, Kenny and Ben. God, we're getting a bit of a collection now. You guys are awesome.
Yes.
As always, we're very grateful for your support. If you'd like to support our weekly work of Pro Tools Answers, you can head over to patreon.com/Pro Tools Answers and possibly select a tier over there. So we're going to be discussing connecting two systems, and it looks like he wants to use one of them to run VIs and the other one to run the DAW, so that he doesn't have to grovel to his wife to buy a new PC. And I have a solution to this. It's relatively simple for me. It's time for a new wife. So I hope that helps answer your question, David. All it leaves me to say is thanks to Anders.
Are you talking about him getting a second wife or changing out the one he's got?
I don't know. I think a second wife might be doubling down on the problem. Right?
Yeah, that's doubling the problem.
That's two people to grovel to.
Wait, David, maybe she's a subscriber and sees this coming. So, what's the other solution? Is there another way to do this?
It'd be awesome if there was a husband and wife subscriber pair. Me and Sonia play Xbox together, and we're one of the few husband and wife pairs that do that kind of thing. I'm sure you're working on Marlin as we speak. But yeah, it would be awesome if there was another like engineering geeky husband and wife pair that subscribed.
I'm sure and that they are out there. If you are out there, let us know down in the comments.
Best start of a show ever.
So, how to connect to different DAWs to work together. One of them obviously hosting the VIs. Pro Tools obviously is doing all of the bulk of the work and the recording. So this could be an interesting discussion.
One of the things he said in there, and I missed it the first time I read it, was he wants a machine that can run VSTs. And obviously Pro Tools doesn't run VSTs unless you do something. Now, if he just wants to run VSTs, then one of the things you might want to take a look at, if you're not dealing with a system power issue, if what you want is to run VSTs, take a look at Bluecat Audio. I think it's called Patchwork, which will allow you to run VSTs within basically a wrapper inside of Pro Tools, and it works great. It works fantastic. It's a great little plugin. If he wants more power, obviously that doesn't help him. But if he's just looking to, for an easy, cheap solution to be able to run VSTs in Pro Tools, that would be my first recommendation.
Is that an ambiguity in terms, though? Because VST obviously is the plugin format, but VST also stands for Virtual Studio Technology.
Yeah.
And we tend to think of them as instruments. VST is like an interchangeable term for virtual instruments, right?
Right. Well, it's kind of become. VST plugins can be delays. It can be any kind of plugin. VSTi is the instrument kind of category, but everybody I think people will talk about VSTs and VSTis interchangeable. But but regardless, if you want something that runs VST plugins in any form, you can get around it without having to buy another computer. That doesn't give you more processing power, but it does give you the ability to host VSTs inside of Pro Tools, and it does a good job.
That's a really good point, and I think it's only about 40 of my pounds. He might not have to grovel to Mrs. David that hard, but he said that his computer was an i9.
Sounds like a speed machine to me.
Yeah, i9 PC. So you should have a significant.
But I see another possibility here is maybe he's. I don't know his situation. Maybe he's using a lot of virtual instruments and a lot of tracks. If you're doing orchestral work and stuff like that, that might be the usage case here. So,
does Patchwork run AUs as well as VSTs? So it is a solution to be able to bring any format into an AAX environment.
Yeah, AU and VSTs are very, very, very similar. In fact, I think somebody told me that an AU is simply a wrapped VST. So Patchwork does support VST and AU instruments. The one thing that it doesn't do, which isn't a huge deal for instruments, but it can be a huge deal for other things, is it doesn't report the latency of those plugins because that plugin format doesn't report latency, which is why AAX is substantially different. It tells Pro Tools how latent it is, what kind of latency it's introducing into your mix, so that Pro Tools can compensate for that latency and keep everything sample accurate. Anytime you use any kind of wrapper, or if you use any of the other solutions that we're going to talk about here, obviously that goes out the window because there's no reporting to Pro Tools.
That was going to be. You've led into my next question, actually. What limitations does Patchwork impose on us? compared to using an AEX version of the plugin. And obviously latency reporting is one of them.
Latency reporting is one. I'm not sure if I've ever tried to freeze these tracks, but I wonder if that would work. I'm not sure. I honestly don't know. I haven't tried it. But but other than that, it works pretty well. Do you remember F Expansion? Their F Expansion wrapper. I'll be honest, and I don't think I'm letting out any state secrets, but it was kind of hit or miss. I mean, there would be some times that it worked. There'd be other times that it would immediately crash your system. And when Patchwork came out, I was pleasantly surprised at how relatively stable it was. And obviously with VST being kind of open source, you can run into some pretty rough plugins. So there's just some.
I just love the expression "relatively stable." That's not something that you want to have if you're using this professionally.
Sure, completely. There's good. That's one of the limitations. Well, VST is just it's kind of the Wild West sometimes, and you can get some of them are fantastic, some of them are relatively rough.
Something in my mind says there were some limitations with being able to connect the VSTs hosted in Patchwork to physical encoders on controllers, so they wouldn't map.
I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, because it's basically running inside the shell of another plugin, right? So I've never tried mapping it. I can kind of try this while you guys are talking, but
I think I have, but a while ago for some kind of lesson that I was preparing, and something in my mind says that I couldn't, or it would work for some but wouldn't work for others maybe.
Yeah, I have to be honest here, I haven't used either. Using wrappers is against my life philosophy.
Well, there you go.
No, not really. No, I'm using one wrapper actually, I used to use one wrapper, and that was the Waves shell. But I've moved away from Waves plugins, but that's the wrapper that I've used.
Okay. Well, so that's an interesting alternative to what he wants to do. So if his computer can handle all of the extra stuff, then maybe he can host everything in Pro Tools using the wrapper for not a lot of money. And that's Bluecat. Bluecat Audio is the company, isn't it? And Patchwork is the name of the plugin.
But if this guy David is anything like us, he wants to go the extra mile here and build a very sophisticated, complicated system because he knows that it will work and he wants to use that. So how can he do this?
So the first question that I would ask if I was setting up a system for him is does he just want something that's going to run plugins, basically being a processing box, or is it going to sound that way? It does sound that way, right? Or does he want something that will sync up with it in terms of position, like bar one, so on and so forth? If he wants just a box that's running probably virtual instruments, because that's the one that in my experience, those are the big beefy ones, especially for orchestral libraries, like Andrew said. It's a relatively simple situation. You just need to make sure that you've got MIDI coming out of the MIDI tracks in Pro Tools. So the MIDI will live in your Pro Tools system. It goes out of your audio interface.
Through a MIDI cable, you mean here?
Yeah. Through
old school. Yeah, we're talking old school MIDI.
Yeah. Five pinned in, and it goes into a MIDI interface on the remote computer. And on another DAW or Pro Tools or whatever, it doesn't matter. At that point, you just have a DAW that's basically just a holder for those other virtual instruments, right? And you're done, right? There's no syncing.
So basically, you have on the second machine, you would have a couple of tracks with your virtual instruments on them that would listen to the corresponding MIDI channel, so MIDI channel 1 and stuff like that. And how would you get that sound of those plugins returned into Pro Tools then?
Well, this is where Anders and I disagreed. I wanted to go digital because I hate the noise that comes with cables sometimes.
I totally go digital as well.
Anders likes that. Anders likes that analog ground loop hum. He thinks
That's the signature Tom Kraftwerk sound. You know, like Muscle Shoals has a sound.
It's just ground loop.
50 cycle.
But you're totally right.
The fish tank.
And for David, you're mentioning ADAT in your email here, and that was probably the best way to go for you, like using the ADAT inputs and outputs of your interfaces, connect those up.
So that's the second thing, right? So how much do you want to have to submix in the remote computer, right? And so in a perfect world, I would want to have one channel for every instrument coming out of that computer. Now that,
or a couple of channels,
or a couple channels of a stereo, right? That, we're starting to talk some real money at that point. That might turn out to be
really,
expensive.
Andy, he's using the 002 rack, right?
He's got a 002 rack.
That had
003 rack.
That had two ADAT outputs. So you'd go. So one ADAT output has 16 tracks, right?
8.
Eight.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Sorry,
I'm
thinking. Yeah.
But isn't it sample rate dependent? If you're 44 to 48, it's 8.
Yeah, so he'd still get
upwards, it's
16 at 48K. That's fine with me.
Well, but he has to then get another interface for his other computer that spits out 8 channels.
Yep.
You know what I'm saying? So I mean, I'm not saying yes or no. I'm just telling you these are the things, the decisions you have to make when you're building your system. So he's got the 003. That 003 has ADAT optical. Now, two things to keep in mind: SPDIF and ADAT optical are different things. So there's that fiber optic cable. If you're using SPDIF, it's only 2 channels. So something that has a fiber optic connection does not necessarily support ADAT optical. It often does, but doesn't always.
What about keeping this a little simple and keeping just talking about the analog signal paths for the time being? So we'll talk about how to get the two Pro Tools systems. Let's assume actually that the second computer is just going to be hosting virtual instruments. He's going to play MIDI into that, and it's going to play them like a keyboard, and then send each of those instruments back out to the master Pro Tools system through analog cables. And then as long as you've got that signal flow kind of in your mind, you can then upgrade to digital if you decide to, or
right
as your knowledge increases.
But I'm saying this: I mean, it's not so much a digital or analog question; it's a number of outputs question.
Yes,
because if you want to get an inexpensive interface that only has 2 outs on your remote computer, that means you're going to have to do a lot of submixing in that remote computer, or you're going to have to record your other channels one at a time, which it's not going to be a time saver. It's that's going to be a bit of a nightmare. And when it comes down to channel count per dollar, the cheapest way to get audio in and out is going to be digital, because there's no conversion required.
Yeah, so any interface with ADAT, I mean ADAT is usually a cheap alternative here. So a couple of ADAT ins and outs, and he already has those on his Digi 102. So yeah, fantastic. And still you could use more instruments than that and just submix some stuff that belong together.
And that's another way you could go.
How would that work between the two systems then?
It goes out of an audio interface on the remote computer through ADAT optical ports, right? It goes into the 003 on the 003's optical ports. Done.
That's it. Basically, what you would use then is audio tracks inside your main Pro Tools rig, or aux tracks. And those would always be listening to the signal coming from the secondary machine, right? So that's how you get all of your playback at the same time from one of the machines.
Could you do that with
monitors?
Could you do that with analog cables? You sure could. Zero problem. You absolutely can. And there's one, if you go digital, there's one other thing that you have to make sure that you take care of, and that's clocking. So one of your devices, one of your computers, needs to be the clock master, and the other one is the clock slave. So probably your clock master is going to be your Pro Tools system, the 003, and then you would have on the remote computer, whatever your interface, its clock source would not be set to internal; it'd be set to whatever the digital connections between those two computers is.
Yeah, so David asked the question where to set that up, and of course we will show him, right? So if you go to set up hardware, this is where you set up what computer is the master. And in my case here, you can see the clock master is my Matrix Studio. So that's the interface that handles the clock. And you can see this grayed out right now. And this might be the case when you have a session open. So you might need to close your session to be able to change the clock master in your setup. Yeah.
And is the clocking data sent with, because both of those, the 8 pre and the 003 have a BNC for word clock. So are they going to be synced with the word clock?
No, that clocking information will usually be derived from the ADAT signal. So just having one of these, if your main system is the clock master, you have to have an output cable going into the, let's say, Cubase computer over there, so that it will receive that signal. But if you set the Cubase computer to be the clock master, you only need to receive signals from that. So you would set Pro Tools to be your slave in that case, and you'd only have to have cables going in that direction.
I think in the Focusrite's front-end GUI, you'd need to set whether that clock is being sent/received with the through the BNC or through the ADAT.
Yeah, so you could you use the BNC connector? Sure, you could. Absolutely, you can. But using the ADAT optical is going to do exactly the same thing, because all digital audio, ASEBU, ADAT optical, SPDIF, all these formats have embedded word clock in them. So connecting it by just a BNC or having it ride piggyback on the digital audio signal, both does exactly the same thing.
Yeah. And there'll be a light on both systems that say whether it's locked.
Yeah, usually. And
so one thing to look for.
The only thing is make sure that
modification here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. No, so if Pro Tools is your slave, and you only have ADAT cables going into Pro Tools from the Cubase machine, the Cubase machine has no possible means of knowing that sync is there. He will just send the signal out because he's the master, and he's not expecting anything in return to say we're in sync. But Pro Tools will know it's a slave, so he will just be fine with that. So you'll be in sync. The problem is if both computers are set to slave, or both of them are set to masters, or if you set Pro Tools machine to master and don't send the signal over to the Cubase machine, that's where you will have a problem.
So here's one way you could do it. And generally speaking, so the question becomes now, and Anders, you said what I was about to say, is you have to have one system using the internal clock of its interface. That's your master, okay? And then you have to have all the other systems following that master clock in some format. Now, if, just to use your example, Anders, let's say that you're running Cubase on a remote computer, but the interface on that remote computer isn't as reliable, it doesn't have as good of a clock as the 003 on your Pro Tools system, let's say. Okay, then in that case, you want that Pro Tools system to be the master clock because it's got the more stable low jitter clock. Okay, in that case, Dave, what I would do is I would take that BNC connector, and the BNC connector coming out of the 003 would go into the remote computer's interface, and then you would set Cubase or whatever that DAW, you would set the hardware driver, you would set that to clock to word clock coming in on the BNC, right? And then digital is coming to Pro Tools from that remote computer, and that's not we're not using that for synchronization at all. We're letting Pro Tools be the master. There's a lot of ways you can do this, right?
And you're saying this under the assumption, of course, that both interfaces have both the digital formats. You're saying a BNC for clocking and the ADAT, but a lot of cheaper interfaces only have the ADATs in and outs. And in that case, you would just connect an ADAT optical cable to the Cubase computer, and the only thing that you would send is the clocking information. Yeah.
In David's case, and it was his question, he's got the 8 Pre, which does have a word clock output, and the 003R, which does have a word clock output.
Yeah, perfect. Then either way is fine for you, David.
Yeah, if you follow, there's a few basic rules, right? You can only have one master clock. Everything else has to follow the master. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is that you would choose the interface that has the lowest jitter, and sometimes jitter specs can be a little bit hard to track down, but you can find them if you look hard. Beyond that, then, as long as you don't need any positional reference, in other words, as long as that other computer is just being a dumb box that's creating sound that isn't chasing to the timeline in Pro Tools, you're done. You don't need to do anything else.
Yeah, you're saying something that's really important here. In this scenario that we've just painted up, basically the Cubase computer, if we call it that, is just playing back the MIDI information that it's sent to it. There's no synchronization in position, as you said, so it doesn't know on what bar it is or anything. It's just basically playing the virtual instruments like an external synthesizer, right? So
it's exactly You're using it like we used to use. You're using it like we used to use rack mount synth modules back in the day.
Yeah. Is there a way to get these two systems synchronized so that you could have stuff on your timeline in Cubase and have that synchronized to your Pro Tools machine?
You can do that, right? And at that point, we start to get into a fairly deeper level of complexity. At that point, what we have to do is we have to send. Let's say that word clock is speed reference. It tells how fast to play the samples, right? But it doesn't tell you position. It doesn't tell you bar 1 or bar 7 or bar anything like that. To do that, you need a positional reference. Can I share
my screen for this?
Do it.
Yeah.
And usually, for MIDI kind of systems, the cheapest way to get started with that is to use MIDI timecode, or MIDI machine control. MIDI timecode as well. So
the MIDI timecode is that like a positional reference being transferred over the MIDI cable, right? So so it's basically the SEMPTI information. It's like a time code being sent through the MIDI cable. Do we need to enable this feature in Pro Tools?
We do.
So how do I do it?
Come on, man, you know this.
So in the peripherals menu here, we have the synchronization tab, which is the first one, where we have the MTC MIDI timecode reader and generator. So basically, that's just setting that to a port, MTC generator port. Where do I output my MIDI timecode? And just set that to be your MIDI interface, and MIDI timecode will be sent through the MIDI cable.
By the way, just go ahead in there, go into that menu again, because that could be a little bit distracting, because one of the things that you're seeing here is a list of all the MIDI and instrument tracks in your session, which is not very useful for what you want to do. What you want to do is you want to send it out a physical output, and so the place to look for it is way down there at the bottom, which is your predefined, and you choose a port of a physical interface that you have.
Yeah, so I have an 8-port MIDI interface, so I could select one of these. So if I select port 4, the MTC will be output through MIDI port 4.
And you've got 16 channels available on that port 4, haven't you?
That's right. But I believe, and I would have to double check myself on that, but MIDI timecode I don't believe is channel dependent.
Sends out through everything, right?
Not for, So So you're just using one port to transfer the time code.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I've got this set up now. So basically, from this moment on, every time I play back Pro Tools will send out this MTC signal through the MIDI cable, and the Cubase machine needs to, of course, receive this MTC information and chase it. So basically, that would be, I can't change this right now, but that would be the MTC reader port, which is set to sync HD, because that's
but it'd be the reader port on the Cubase system.
On the Cubase machine, exactly. So you'd need to go into the equivalent area in Cubase, which I can't help you with because I haven't used Cubase since 2002 or something.
Yeah. Now let's clarify something here. That MIDI time code is going to require one cable all to itself.
You can send other MIDI data through it.
Yes, but if it's plugged into one port of the of Anders interface, which is then going to be plugged into one port on the Cubase MIDI interface, yeah, and it's not channel dependent, that means that only the time code is going to be sent through port 4 when we're wanting to send the instrument.
No, you can send that all together.
Is that not going to be that's going to need to be set up on a separate MIDI port?
No, I think
isn't it?
I think Dave, I think you're right. You need actually two MIDI ports to do this.
So you're going to need an interface with multiple MIDI ins and outs and multiple MIDI cables, and the cost of those MIDI cables we're talking €1, €2, €3, £4 each.
Now, by the way, it's if you're not picking this up, it's been a long time since any one of us have actually dealt with this, and one of the things I will say is that MIDI.
I spend a lot of time working with old school MIDI. It's my chosen format.
MIDI time code is a sync reference. That's what I'm talking about. Yeah, I use MIDI cables all the time as well. But I will say this: when you're using MIDI time code, when we set up professional systems, it's the one that I try to avoid because it is inconsistent in terms of the accuracy of its timing, in ways that linear time code and VITC and other forms of SMPTE are not. So, which I think is a longer discussion. I mean, if you wanted to do LTC chasing, you could do that. You could stripe an LTC track. I mean, you can go deep down that rabbit hole, and hopefully that's not what this person wants to do. He just wants to have another computer that makes sounds. But we can.
He certainly doesn't want to justify extra stuff to the wife.
Yeah, so one part of the problem that Andy mentioned here is it will actually need 2 frames of length just to transmit the time code, the length of that time code. So it basically has half of the accuracy of as normal time code using frames. So it's basically 12 positional references per second, which isn't a lot.
It's a little sloppy when it comes to timing.
But you can do it, and we're talking about possibilities here. And there is also, as we started out when we're talking about the Bluecat audio wrapper plugin, the similar situation when you're doing this is like when you're returning the signal into Pro Tools. Pro Tools has no possible way of understanding the latency induced by the Cubase machine. So you will have a signal coming into Pro Tools that has some latency attached to it. You might need to compensate for this in Pro Tools. You can guesstimate it and you can measure it, but this will also, it might vary. And
you know what you could do?
It might be, yeah.
You could set it up as a hardware insert.
Yeah, sure. You could measure
because
it. I mean,
hardware inserts, you can compensate for the round trip.
Yeah, exactly.
Delay.
Yeah.
So you can get around it. I mean, you can, but it's something you do have to get around. And Anders is 100% right that you're going to get some degree of slop in terms of the time, just because it's 2 different computers.
But on the other hand, don't let this deter you. I mean, people have been doing music with latent hardware for like since the 80s, and if it sounds good, it's good.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But one of the areas to remember the latency will be introduced will be your hardware buffer. So
Yep.
Making sure your buffers are nice and low. But that could potentially cause problems if you're going to be using the second Cubase computer for running these things live, because if you've got the whole system set up on Pro Tools running a very low buffer and it's quite a thick session, you may not have enough power to run that system for the purposes of low latency.
Well, and there's the buffer on the other DAW as well, right? So which is likely to be which Pro Tools has no idea. So I mean, there's
a lot to consider.
But before you get too upset about it, like Anders says, we lived that way in the '80s, and it hasn't aged us at all.
Wait, I know Andy looks fantastic for 25.
Yeah, exactly.
But as you said, there are plenty of ways of syncing everything back up when it arrives in the DAW. Nudging, as you said, was one. Control clicking, matching up your clip boundaries is another sync points. It's not impossible.
And using hardware insert is a genius move there, Andy.
Okay. Is there anywhere else we could go on this question?
No, but David, we are excited to hear about your progress then. So let us know how it goes. And when you have your two machines playing together, let us know down in the comments below.
Yeah,
and for any other of you, because I'm 100% sure that there are plenty of people running really, really cool setups out there. And maybe there are even ways to do this that we haven't thought of. So let us know.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Okay. All right. Well, all it leaves me to say is if you haven't yet done so, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit like on the video if you've been liking what we're doing. You can head over to protoolsanswers.com and you can subscribe over there. Andy writes to all of our subscribers every week. It's a privilege to receive those. I'm sure everyone will agree. And you can also pick up some exclusive Pro Tools Answers merch while you're there as well.
Really? What kind of merch?
Well, we're doing a pretty good job at modeling it. I'm not sure about the other guy.
No, I'm sorry. I forgot to put mine on today.
This lack of dedication is disturbing.
You can head over to protoolsanswers.com as well if you fancy supporting the channel. And hopefully you're sticking with us. Hopefully it's all helping you understand Pro Tools and hoping you have a good time and be incredibly creative with the app as well. So that leaves me to say thank you very much to Anders.
Thank you.
And thank you to Andy. My name's Dave. This is Pro Tools Answers, and we're out.